Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. How are you? And good. Thank you, Dan, for inviting me here today. And as Dan said, we did meet and had an opportunity to come to this event earlier in the year. And it really is an exciting space. And so I talked to Dan about one aspect of med devices and MedTech, which is IP. I mean, who here has a medical technology, a device of some kind? Who here has intellectual property? If you have MedTech and if you have a device, you have intellectual property. Everybody has intellectual property. You probably may not even recognize it, and you may even have more intellectual property than you think. So today we're going to talk about licensing medical technology. And what I'm going to be focusing on is the fact today, especially in this market, and for small business and entrepreneurs who know how to use their IP, there really are some big opportunities out there because the market is changing very quickly. And so I'm going to approach today's presentation from two aspects of it. First, when you should use it, and second, how to use it. So a little background about my company. Three areas that I focus on: strategy and consulting, meaning how do you manage your IP and what do you do with it? The second is audits and due diligence. You audit and you have an inventory of your hard assets, your plant, equipment, finances, your products on shelves, your inventory. But have you ever done an audit for your IP assets? How many have? Probably nobody. Yet it's probably one of the most important audits that you'll ever want to do because the most valuable asset you have in your company is your intellectual property. If you look around today, what do you see in the news going on between these big technology companies, even pharmaceutical companies? What's happening in the litigation markets? What are they fighting over? Spending hundreds of millions of dollars fighting over? Intellectual property. It's infringement lawsuits. It's arguments over who owns what. It's acquiring intellectual property portfolios. Some of the biggest acquisitions today are made. They're not buying the plant. They're not buying the equipment. They're buying the intellectual property portfolios. And you say, why is that? Because they're staking out a claim in what now has become the most important asset that's driving business, every business across the globe. And a lot of that is being driven because intellectual property laws have been changing. A lot of new players are coming to the market very quickly, most notably out of Asia. And finally, licensing and compliance. Now, licensing is a side of the business that I find many companies, many individuals don't understand, but it's a way of leveraging and using your IP assets to do a lot of things. One of them is generate money with them, but you can do more than that. You can use them to raise capital. You can use them to collateralize loans. You can use them to expand your business. You can use them to get R&D. You can use IP to get any kind of resource that you may be lacking. You can use R&D to pay company employees through equity positions or even investors through equity. It's an asset that is very versatile and one that isn't known a lot about simply because it's come to the forefront in the last 15 years. In fact, many accounting boards and even the government are struggling with what do you do with all these intangible assets that are sitting on the balance sheets of corporations, because today 80% of the value of most companies is in their intellectual property and their intangible assets, yet they're not being accounted for. In fact, one estimate says that if they accounted for it, the GDP would be much higher. So it means there's a lot of value there, and in the course of my time in working with companies of all sizes across the board, MedTech, health tech, data tech, entertainment technology, consumer data, one thing has come clear is that there is a demand for it, and the question is, how can you leverage your IP? How can you leverage the technology? So today we're going to talk about that. And as I said, I'm going to cover it really in two parts. One is when to use licensing, because it's important to understand when to use it. And I'm going to take you through 6 key points on that. Why it's a smart strategy, especially for the MedTech market, how it works, and of course the money part of it, because it always comes down to money, and some keys to success. And so it's interesting, what do investors and licensees have in common? The answer is they're all interested in value. The second is they want to know how much money they're going to make. And the third is They want to know if the risk is mitigated. Much like Ken said this morning, well, it's true. And so when using licensing, you take a look at the market and you understand where your intellectual property fits. Licensing is really a strategy that you should use if you fall into any of these areas, one or more of these areas. If it's incremental IP, if it's complex, requiring a lot of R&D, if it's a highly competitive market that's dominated by big players, if it's a changing or a market that's in flux, licensing is a good strategy. And finally, if you're lacking experience, resources, operational management, marketing, licensing is an excellent strategy for that. Because you have to understand with licensing, you're able to tap into somebody else's resources that are out there. So in looking at the medical device industry, the medical technology industry, for those of you that have technology or devices, you obviously know it's a big industry. It's one of the biggest in healthcare. And really what we're talking about is the fact that we're reaching a point where consumers can get more actively involved. They can monitor their healthcare, they can manage it, and it's toward personal wellness. And this is a big trend that's going on. This morning we saw an example of a MedTech device. There's other devices that I've met here, but they all have a common theme, and that is for the management of wellness, the management of health, some kind of device that attaches to your body that you can use that's portable. This is what's going on in the medical technology industry today, and it's huge. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars at stake here. And as a result of that, competition is immense in this industry. And in the last several years, most notably, starting in 2009, 2010, new technologies have been flooding the market space. Patents have been skyrocketing to thousands and tens of thousands of new patents entering the market all around the medical device, medical technology market. And the result is that there's lots of new IP coming in, but the interesting thing to keep in mind here is the difference between whether your technology, your IP, is incremental or breakthrough. Does everybody know the difference? Breakthrough, something that starts the new Facebook, opens up a brand new industry, has never been done before. Incremental, on the other hand, is improving something that already exists. Improving products, improving technologies. And what you're seeing today is a lot of medical technology, medical devices. What are they doing? They're improving the way that health care is being delivered. They're improving the way a lot of devices, a lot of ways that patients are taken care of, whether it's drawing blood, monitoring glucose, checking your EKG, whatever it is. It's all coming down. It's being miniaturized. It's being put into devices, home devices. And what are these devices doing? They're connecting data and sending it out so that suddenly it can be done remotely. But what's happening is it's also generating lots of new designs and configurations for all types of products, especially in the wearable market. You see that coming on strong. And the result is it's also shortening the commercial lifespan. How many of you have a patent? Patent goes for 20 years. But what's the commercial life of your underlying technology? If it's in the device world, if it's in a product world, it's shrinking very rapidly. Why is that? It's because it's being replaced very quickly by all the new incremental IP, new upgrades, new designs that are coming onto the market. The next thing to keep in mind, too, is medical technology. Is it a simple technology? Are med devices easy to build? Can you go in your garage and tinker around, put one together, and stick it on the market? No. Many of these devices and technologies are not. They're complex. First of all, it's a convergence of technology. You're looking at mechanical, you're looking at electrical, you're looking at systems engineering, and you're looking at information technology all coming together inside these little devices. Second piece is inside these devices you're using a lot of integrated technology, and in many cases it's not your own technology. Those circuits, the power management, the LED screens, the apps, do you own all that? No. In many cases, you have to license it. When you look at these computers, when you look at smartphones today, they're bundles of IP. These companies don't own all that IP. They get a design patent on what it looks like, and then they go out to licensing pools and license the rights to use all the components that they shove inside. And then they turn around and sue each other over the look of the phone. That's another story. The point being is that without those patent pools, without all that stuff that goes inside, nobody would ever be able to make anything. Well, the same holds true of medical device and medical device technology. It's getting to the point where there's a lot of integrated circuitry that's going to become critical to the development of these devices, and patent pools are being formed around that to allow you to be able to continue to make your medical devices, your medical technology. Third point is it's not cheap to make a medical device or medical technology. A lot of high R&D costs. Yes? Everybody agree on that one? It means high risk. Does it always work? No. Do you get to find out early on or after you've spent the millions of dollars? You get to find out later. And then finally, as you just heard, you've got a rigorous R&D or regulatory approval. In fact, it's much more rigorous than your standard consumer products. Why is that? Because these devices are designed to, in some cases, save lives, monitor vital signs. They require a much higher level of quality and effectiveness than if your iron stops working and you can take it back to the Walmart. Fortunately, if your med device stops working and it's monitoring your heart rate, I'm not sure you're going to want to run back to Walmart to change that in. So the point is it's built on complex technologies. And one that's happening right now, who knows where this market is going? It's in a total state of flux. You've got insurers who are investing in medical technologies. You've got retailers who are wanting to get into the delivery, treating patients. You've got a lot of non-traditional companies that are coming into the market, and I'm going to talk about this. You've got bedless hospitals, virtual healthcare. So where is this market going? Anybody have an idea? Where are you going to position it? Is it one day going to be walking into Kmart and finding your pacemaker on aisle 15? Quite possibly. So you don't know, which makes it very difficult if you are trying to grow your business, trying to figure out where you're fit, trying to figure out where to position your product in the market. And here's one that really is putting a lot of pressure on that. You've got a lot of big players, and I'm not talking about just your traditional pharma and medical device. Moving into this market, you've got huge high-tech players and big electronics, consumer electronics companies, and there you are stuck in the middle. That's pretty formidable competition because these companies have got you outstaffed, out-resourced, out-legaled, out-everything. And they're growing. So the question is, where are these companies going? Because you need to know that. How many of you are developing or have developed or selling some kind of diagnostic device? Anybody? This first column here on your right-hand side, those are just the top big players who are getting patents. And those circles, those are not just one or two patents. Those are hundreds and sometimes thousands. If you're playing in the diagnostic area, you're up against very intense competition. And it goes across the board, from therapeutics to drug delivery to everything else. Suddenly you see where these players are. And that's just, by the way, a search on medical devices. When you search medical technology, you get another list of players coming in. And the next question to ask is, where are they going? Well, you all have heard the Internet of Things. Medical devices are at the top of the list, medical technology. Well, where they're going is these huge companies are forming big partnerships. Partnerships between J&J and Google, Medtronic, J&J, and IBM, and on and on and on. Why are they doing this? Because they see where the market's going, and they want to continue to be number one in their market, and they see new opportunities. So when you see this happening, the question you have to ask yourself is, how are you going to compete against this marketplace? How are you going to do it? Do you have hundreds of millions to compete against these people? Can you secure shelf space? Can you beat them? No. If you can't beat them, then you have to join them. That's why licensing is a smart strategy, because they want your MedTech IP. Just look around today and you'll find innovation portals popping up all over, not only in MedTech and med devices, but in all industries, where you can go and you can submit your IP for their consideration. Now, I don't particularly like these portals, because I look at these portals are like vacuum cleaners. They turn them on, and guess what they get? They get all the stuff coming through, all right? And it's tough enough trying to develop a viable technology that's going to sell, but can you imagine sitting at the other end of one of these portals and what's coming through there every day, the hundreds and hundreds of submissions? So it's kind of like a shotgun approach, but it's not the most successful approach for them, because the person sitting at the other end may or may not understand your technology, may or may not be qualified to understand it, may or may not be one person who gets thousands of submissions. Who knows? It may sit there idle, which it usually does, or maybe you hear back from them 6 months from now. So why would these big companies want your medical technology? Why would they want to partner with you? Well, the biggest reason is because they can't do the R&D themselves anymore. The reason is the market's moving too quick. These are giants. They're used to operating in an environment where they have these giant R&D. Anybody used to work or work in these giant companies in the R&D? So you know you've got this process that goes on, and it's a very long, laborious, slow process. The market doesn't work that way anymore. The market is moving so fast, they need to find a way to tap into that, and the only way they can do it is by everybody in this room, because you can move fast. You're developing. You're at the forefront of this thing. They lack the innovation organization. Most of the time, they're not even risk takers because they're inside an organization. So they can't even incubate their own IP. In fact, many of these large corporations have portfolios of IP they can't even commercialize, simply because their organizations are too big to work as a startup, and they don't have the time, and they can't afford to focus the resources on it. So that's why licensing is a smart strategy for you, for every company here. And what I want to talk about is the difference between licensing and a licensing, because I've found that it's often misunderstood. The first thing to know is licensing is a process. Much like marketing is a process, licensing goes through a cycle. There are things you do in the licensing process, I'm going to talk about it, that you have to go through. But it also involves in managing your IP, figuring out where it's going to go, strategizing it, positioning it, figuring out your terms, identifying who your partners could be, reaching out to them, communicating, following up, all those kind of things. On the other side is a license. A license is a legal agreement. It's what goes at the end of the licensing process. Once you've agreed to all the terms, all the conditions, you feel you're the right partner, you write up a licensing agreement. So licensing is much more than just an agreement. It's a process. And the process starts, and the best way to start the process is first by validating your technology through test markets, through consumer feedback, whatever the question is. And then from there, it moves into researching who your partners, potential partners might be, contacting them, presenting and discussing. And again, many of the things that you heard about this morning from Ken on investor presentations, a lot of those same things hold true when you're dealing with presenting your IP for licensing, okay? You have to understand that you have to present it the right way. You have to give the right information to the right people and follow along this process. And of course, it gets into negotiation and eventually signing the licensing agreement. But this part is the part that I want to spend a few minutes on, because this is where I find that most people, most companies fall down. You spend too much time telling stories. Okay, you've been on the other side of the desk. How much time do you have to review an unsolicited email about a new technology that comes to you with 14 paragraphs of information? Nothing. What have you got? You got 1 minute to make your point. 1 minute. So what you want to do is you want to solve problems. You want to keep it concise. One of the hardest things to do is to take a look at your technology and say, okay, if I only had 150 words, how am I going to explain what this technology is, what it does, how it solves problems, and why it's going to make money? Can you do that? Because that's what you need to do. You need to be able to get that concise. Nobody has the time to review all this information. They need to know, is it worth having a conversation with you? Is it worth exploring this IP? So you've got to focus on what problem does it solve, what solution does it provide, and say it in a 1 or 2 sentence email. Now, there's ways you can research. LinkedIn is a great tool. LinkedIn can get you to just about anybody in any company. Of course, the challenge now is figuring out who the person is that you need to talk to. Because inside these companies, you've got a lot of departments, a lot of divisions, a lot of people working on technology. You have to find the right person and be able to communicate to them to open up the conversation. And as you work your way through that process, the ultimate end goal is a licensing agreement, which is an agreement that you're going to partner with this company to leverage your IP, to make money, to get R&D, to figure out future applications of it, uses. But I'm not going to get into the details of a licensing agreement because it can get very lengthy, and later this afternoon you're going to hear more on the legal side of intellectual property. The point of bringing up the contract here is just to get you to understand that what it really does is it specifies the rights to your IP. Is it going to be exclusive or non-exclusive? Okay, what territory is it going to be in? What field of use? How many places can it be used? See, the goal of licensing, when you look at your intellectual property, when you look at your technology, that's the importance of doing an audit and stepping back. It's not always necessarily just one way that your IP can be applied. It can have application to many markets, many different industries. It's not uncommon to see intellectual properties that were originally developed for one industry being used in another. Like Play-Doh came out of the building industry, used to patch walls, and turned into one of the hottest selling toys. Okay? These kind of things happen. Olestra, which originally was a ground contamination, turned into a fat substitute, or the other way around. I think they started a fat substitute, decided it didn't work, put it as a contamination. The point being, you have to think about your technology and really, where does it go? Where can it apply? Does it go inside more than one device? Does it have applications beyond what I'm using it for? Because that's the importance. Where you don't want to wind up in a contract is you go in and you find a company, they're very excited about your technology, says, oh yes, we'll take exclusive to everything. And you lock up exclusive rights to everything and then discover there's more places you can go. Dan had mentioned I came out of the studios. When I was at the studios, licensing, the one thing that we're very careful about is exclusive. Nobody got an exclusive unless they were going to pay millions of dollars, number one. And number two, the reason they didn't get exclusives is because they knew with entertainment content there were so many ways that could be leveraged. And to give it to any one company was just, you're leaving money on the table. Now that's the same way you have to think about your IP. In some cases it may have a single application, in which case then it's one company. But in other cases, if you really understand your rights and where can it go, you have to think about how I can carve it out. And by the way, when you use licensing, you don't necessarily have to step out of making and selling your own technology. You can use this in conjunction with it. You can give them rights to a foreign territory. You can give them rights to a Fortune 500 market. You can take the smaller companies. Whatever the case is, it doesn't necessarily restrict you. You're working in a partnership. It all depends on what you want to do and where you want to go. So you specify the rights. Number two, which I'm going to talk a little bit more, is it calculates payments. How are you going to get paid? It's called royalties. Everybody wants to get paid. And these could be percentages, fixed, annual, fee, equity, consulting. I mean, there's many ways you can get paid in licensing. It's not just one way, and you have to be creative about it. Sometimes you get up front, sometimes you don't. And nothing's fixed in stone. Sometimes royalties go up. I've even been in situations where the royalty rate goes down. I'm not sure how that one worked, but it happens. The point being is it's a very creative agreement that, again, if you think about your rights, where it could be used, how to leverage it, then when you figure out your payments and royalties, all of these can be calculated, because the goal of getting paid is to what? It's to maximize your income, maximize your revenue. And that's why it's important to think about where your IP can go. It also details the responsibilities, who does what and when. Important to understand, a licensing agreement is performance-based. Every agreement that I negotiate is going to include benchmarks, milestones, payment dates. If you don't do this by then this happens. If you don't execute, if you don't pay me, if you do execute, if you want an option to renew, then you have to earn this much money. It's all performance-based. Do not do a licensing agreement that is not performance-based. That's the point, to get it into the market. I can assure you, when I was at the studios, we had marketing dates. You didn't hit that marketing date, by the next day I was on the phone going, guess what? You didn't make it out to the market. We can yank this license, and boy, they scrambled fast. So that's the same thing that you need to do, that you must do inside your licensing agreement, is make sure it's performance-based. And that's part of the responsibilities of who's going to do what. And finally, how is that agreement going to end? Ideally, it ends amicably, or that everybody makes a lot of money. But there's also situations where it may not end amicably. And in this case, it's going to tell you how you either fix those situations or how it's going to end. If you don't pay me and you don't make it, get me my payments within 60 days, the contract's over. If you don't reach this development milestone and you don't do it with 60 days after the milestone date, the contract's over, whatever the case is. Okay? Because it's an agreement between the two of you, and you want to make sure your partner is going to do what they say they're going to do, and you will do what you're going to do. Otherwise, the agreement is going to end. And ideally, the contract will carry through to the end, even go into a renewal. And by the way, a licensing agreement is also the first step toward an acquisition, because if your technology is doing really well, especially if they integrate it into the product line, put their brand behind it, and 5 years later they're doing $100 million or $200 million with your technology, and they've got another 10 or 12 years left on your licensing agreement, what are they going to want to do at that point? Think they want to continue to pay you your $10 million a year? No, probably what you're going to do is get a phone call and sit down and figure out how there's just going to be a buyout. Except the beauty of doing a license agreement is now it's not guesswork of trying to sell your IP without any data. If you work for 4 or 5 years with a company, you've got sales and you've got royalty payments. Now you can sit down and quantitatively calculate what the value of your intellectual property is. And there's lots of firms that do that, lots of formulas that do that. And inevitably, you're going to get a much better and richer price for your intellectual property. And in some cases, they'll even buy it and continue to pay you royalties. That happens too. So going back to payments, going back to value, the one thing to understand about intellectual property and licensing is the closer you are to market ready, the higher you're going to get, the more likely it is somebody's going to want to license your intellectual property, and the higher the value you're going to get for your intellectual property. Now, what you see here is just an example. There are variations in this, many ways that it occurs, but this just gives you an example of the different stages, and medical technology devices all go through these stages at some point, and hopefully they make it through all of them and get onto the market. But you can see here that really, and this goes back to the comment I made earlier, as you go through these stages, what are you doing? You're increasing the value and you're decreasing the risk, right? And as you do that, it's making it more attractive. And as you progress through this, your risk is reducing, your royalty rates now start to increase, because a company is going to be willing to pay you more for your technology as they know it's closer to the market or is on the market and works. It's got to work. That's the biggest risk. Remember, I had mentioned R&D. How do you know if it's going to work till after you spent those millions of dollars and then you find out it doesn't? Your licensing partner would much rather know it's going to work than have to take the risk of figuring out if it will. That's not to say that you couldn't license your technology before you find out if it will work. You can do that, and it is done. But certainly if you could take it to the point where you can prove it on the market through consumer tests. And by the way, a limited test market. I have a client, we just concluded a deal with one of the big pharmaceutical healthcare companies for new oral health care. They tested it by putting it on the market for about 18 months in a very small retail test with just a product that wasn't the finished product, but just to get a sense, would the consumer buy it and what do they think of it? Sure enough, they sold it and they got great feedback, great testimonials. Then they combined that, of course, with all the research and backup data. When we went out to present the technology, they saw it, it met a need in the market, they liked it, and ultimately we just closed a licensing deal just 2 weeks ago with them for the technology. Because they knew that the data was, they saw the data was there, they got the research, they knew it worked, and they said, you know what, let's take a shot at it. And in that case, by the way, when you license, it's not necessarily that you're going to go direct into a full-blown licensing agreement. Oftentimes, with medical technology, any kind of new technology, especially when it applies to oral health care or physical health care, there'll be an evaluation period. They'll want to verify that it does work. So it'll start off as an evaluation agreement. It's still a license agreement, but what you're doing is you're giving them a license to evaluate your technology. It usually runs about 6 to 9 months. Sometimes there's money up front. Sometimes there's not money. Generally, the way that I recommend that you work the deal is if they want to get an evaluation agreement and they want it exclusively and they want you to stop presenting it to other companies, they have to pay you to do that. If they don't want to do that, you can still do an evaluation agreement, although it may be non-exclusively. In this case, with this deal, they weren't willing to pay what we wanted for an exclusive license. Yet they still wanted an evaluation, and they still wanted to know that they had a shot at being the first rights to get that technology if, in fact, we found another licensing partner. So in that deal, we gave them what's known as a first right of refusal. So in lieu of an exclusive, we agreed that what we would do is come to them in the event we found another company that was interested in the technology. That would trigger what's known as an option and give them 45 days to put a deal on the table. Then we get another 45 days to hammer out the licensing terms. So what that did is still keep the technology free for us to pursue another licensing partner at the same time knowing that they're tracking to test this, evaluate it, and then if they like it, come back. Because an evaluation agreement, similar to a licensing agreement, has the same thing. What the timelines are, what you're going to test, when the tests are going to be done, and what's going to happen at the end of the tests. And then from there, generally with the evaluation, it'll roll over into a long-term license agreement. Now, when you look at getting paid, the other part of getting paid is can you get some money up front? I shared with you the example of the evaluation agreement. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. Depends on the technology, the stage of development, what the market is. This is just to give you kind of a sense of what goes on, especially in the medical devices, medical technology. Most of the time you're looking at somewhere around $25,000 to a few hundred thousand, maybe as an upfront fee, with a royalty rate somewhere in the neighborhood of about 5%. That's about standard for the industry. You might get higher, you might get lower. But one thing you need to keep in mind about royalty rate, do not get hung up on the royalty rate. If some company comes to you and says, well, we're going to give you 4%, and you're over there saying, well, wait a minute, no, I want 10%, it's worth more than that. But this is a company that's going to take your technology and put it into a $1 billion marketplace. And let's say they sold $500 million. What would 4% of $500 million be? Probably more than you would be able to generate as a startup business over the next 10 years. So you have to understand that when you go to license in these big markets, these big players, it's not necessarily the size of the royalty rate, but really what's the size of that market? Because if you get a technology placed with one of these companies and they run with it, you're going to get nice big fat checks because these companies generally don't fail. I mean, they do. But if they test out your technology and they run with it, they're going to run with it. And it can be a very lucrative deal. So an example of what you might put together in terms of payment terms, it might be an upfront fee for $25,000 to $50,000. You might get milestone payments. Oftentimes with technology, especially in the medical, you're going to have milestone payments. That's one way of structuring payments. Sometimes they're yearly guarantees. In the other case, it could be milestone. It says when you get to this development phase, you're going to pay X. When you get to this development phase, you're going to pay Y. When you market launch, you're going to pay Z. Okay, that's another way that royalties are paid. The royalty rate, as I said, it could vary 0.5% to 7%. And minimum annual royalties. In addition to development or milestone payments, there can also be minimum royalties that are payable. Sometimes, for instance, in pharmaceutical deals, medical technology deals, the milestone payments are made in the upfront period of the first couple of years because there still is some development. They got to get it to market. You don't necessarily want to sit there and not get paid, but you want to assure that they're going to do what they say they're going to do. So they're going to make milestone payments which are going to be credited toward those royalties. Then once the product is in the market and they're selling it, there's what's called minimum annual guarantees, which means that they're going to guarantee to pay you X amount of money every year regardless of what their sales are. It might be $500,000, it might be $1 million. So if your royalty rate is 5% and they guarantee to pay you $1 million a year, what is that, $5, $10, $20 million? Something like that. If they don't get to $20 million in sales, they still got to pay you $1 million. That's what the contract reads. But generally, if you are working with a company, believe me, these companies, especially if they're large, they've got big marketing departments, technology departments, they figure this all out. And when they sit down and negotiate a deal, they're going to be pretty confident about what they're going to be able to do. And believe me, they're not going to negotiate a deal, come with you and say, oh, we think we're going to do $250 million so that you can then turn around and say, great, give me a $20 million guarantee. No. No. They're going to come back and they're going to negotiate something that's going to be below that, but at a fair price, because they need to be able to know that they can achieve their goals as well. So, in wrapping this up, now is the time to license. And for many of the reasons that I talked about. First of all, you're seeing the medical device market is becoming a high-volume consumer electronics product market. And you all know about that market. You see it every day with your alarm clocks, your iPods, your phones, your devices. That's high-volume, low-margin, big players are in that market. And it's dominated by big companies. And these companies are all consumer savvy. Those companies that I showed you, those high-tech giants, those consumer products giants, and even those medical technology and pharma, these guys are consumer savvy. They've been doing this for decades. They've got departments with hundreds of people that know the consumer market, know the retail market. They know how to do it. So these guys are very savvy. So it's an intensive competitive market, and you're up against a lot of improvements. A lot of changes are going on in this market constantly. These devices are moving very quickly. You know you're here. You see new devices every day, new technologies coming out. That's a lot of competition. The patents are coming on fast and furious, and it's going to continue for as long as this market is driving new technologies, which means you're going to have a shorter lifespan to be able to commercialize and make money with your IP. But most importantly, big companies want your IP today. They're looking for it. That's why you should consider licensing. So summing it up, important points to keep in mind when licensing: good due diligence. Know who you're dealing with. Do homework on the companies. Do homework on the people that you're contacting. Okay? And find the right contact. That can be challenging. Sometimes in the projects that I have, when I go after these big companies, another interesting story, I was working on a technology at the University of Arkansas. It was for the reduction of fat in fried foods, fast foods especially. So the no-brainer was, fried fast foods. Great, I'm going to go to every fast food restaurant here. They're going to take this. They're going to love it. No problem. After I contacted every one of them, from the VP of marketing down to innovation, R&D, none of them were interested. Not one was interested in a fat reduction when they're under pressure. And I thought, what the heck is going on here? Why aren't these people interested? It took me more research, had to dig deep, finally came across an article, presentation that I discovered being given at the University of Austin down in Texas. Turns out that there's a program in there, they're doing studies on how can we reduce fat in fried foods because of the obesity problem is so huge around the world. So I read that study, and saw in there the name of one of the researchers, scientists at Dow. I thought, Dow. Sent an email to him, and within 1 day got a response back. Yes, I want to talk to you. I thought, holy cow. Got on the phone, first question he said, he goes, tell me, how did you figure out how to get a hold of me? And I explained to him that I did the research on that, found your study, saw what you're doing. He goes, that's very innovative. He says, yes, we are doing research work on oils for the fast food industry to help reduce the fat in fried foods. Right now, they can't change their frying process, so we have to figure out a way so they can still use their frying process with reduced fat. Talk about a challenge. From there, I learned Cargill's in that business. DuPont's in that business. Turns out the chicken processing companies that supply the chicken to these fast food companies, they've got VPs dedicated to menu innovation. It's all their food suppliers that are trying to innovate for the fast food companies. So I share that story with you to understand it's not always the most obvious in finding the right contact. Use appropriate information. Don't send out anything proprietary right up front. If you've got trade secrets, there's a way that you can discuss your IP, discuss what it does, talk about the benefits without disclosing the secret sauce. Obviously, if it's patented, that's a different story. You can send the patent. But even behind your patent, more than likely, you've got trade secrets. So be sure that you start off with non-proprietary information till you get to the point where it is under NDA. Think like your partner. What is their problem and how do you solve it? So number one thing, don't blanket send out your IP to a company that isn't going to be able to use it. Are they in that market? What's their problem? How do you solve it? You saw that landscape there. All these companies are in diagnostics. It's a very competitive market. Well, they're patenting. That doesn't mean they found a solution to their problem yet, by the way. That's how I got this oral care technology just placed with a company that we licensed, because I found a very small dot on that landscape. And they hadn't been in that oral health care market before. I said, who the heck is that and what are they doing there? Sure enough, I tracked them down and got a response because, yes, they're trying to get into that market, but they haven't got anything to get in it with. So that's why it's important to think like your partner and understand where they're going. Most important, don't tell them a story. They don't want to know about your background. They don't want to know about your history. They don't want to know how your cousin helped you develop. They don't care about any of that. What problem does it solve? How much money am I going to make? Is it ready to go? That's it. And finally, prove that it works. Companies like to license technology that works. So I thank you very much for your time. I have a newsletter if you're interested. You can sign up. Comes out about every 2 weeks. Talk about licensing strategies, different types of technologies, how to market, how to negotiate, whatever the case is, all different aspects of licensing. So again, thank you for your time, and I'll open it up to any questions.